Hi there. Welcome to AJ's Bible Commentary. If this is your first time here, I want to take a moment to welcome you. What I do here is I take books of the Bible and I help teachers to know how to teach them. So I hope this equips you to be more effective as you're teaching either your Sunday school or your youth group. I pray that it's a blessing to you. And today we're going to be taking a look at an introduction to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is one of my favorite books. I've been teaching through this for a few months now to my youth group, and I've loved this study. I've gotten so much from it. I know my teens have enjoyed it. But before I dive into a book, I kind of want to lay out the context. I think that's really important for us to know, one, what am I trying to teach out of whenever I'm teaching this book of the Bible? Obviously, we want to stay true to the text, we want to stay true to the Word, but we want to make sure that we're emphasizing what God emphasizes in these chapters. And so, the way we do that is we need to put the passage into context. So whenever we're looking at 1 Samuel, we need to remember that 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel were not actually written originally as two different volumes. They were originally one volume that were separated into two scrolls because of their length. So we want to just keep that in mind whenever you if you decide you're going to start a series on 1 Samuel. It's probably wise to recognize that you're going to be teaching 1 and 2 Samuel because that's not as natural of a break as you might originally anticipate it to be. So 1 and Samuel are the same, are one and the same. They were separated because of the length of scrolls. Second thing we need to look at is who wrote this book. We really don't know. Whenever we see books with the title, especially as New Testament Christians, we go, oh, Matthew was written by Matthew, Mark was written by Mark, Luke was written by Luke. It's natural for us to associate the title with the author. And that's true to a point in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but we run into a problem whenever we see that Samuel dies near the end of 1 Samuel. So who wrote 2 Samuel? So who wrote these books? Well, Jewish tradition tells us that it was Samuel wrote part of it, and then Nathan and Gad would have written portions of it as well. But we don't have that emphasized in the text. We don't actually know. There's some scholars think that maybe it was written a few generations later. That's possible. I don't claim to be a authority on that. But for my teens, what I usually just say is it was written by Samuel, Nathan, and Gad. And that clears it up for them. If you want to do more study on that, maybe let me know down in the comments below. The important thing here is that the author of 1 and 2 Samuel didn't feel it was important for them to emphasize who was writing the book. So it's really not too important for us to emphasize who's writing the book. It doesn't particularly matter who wrote this book so much as what was written, and that it is God's Word. And we know ultimately it was inspired by God. But when was this book written? Or when do the events that are written in this book take place? Well, the birth of Samuel is recorded at 1105 BC, and the death of David, or the last words of David, are recorded in 971 BC. So that's about a 135-year span that we're looking at here. And this is a very detailed account of what occurs in those 135 years. For my teens, I'd like to emphasize this was written 3,000 years ago. We're reading a book that has been read or has been accounted for 3,000 years. We as Americans, I always kind of joke around. I say, if we find something in America that's 200 years old, we put a plaque up in front of it. We're like, look at how old this is. But whenever I was in Israel, if something's not pre the first century, we don't even care. Like they're just like, yeah, it's old, but it's not even close to as old as the nation of Israel and what we want to see the temple. We want to see these older archaeological and historical locations. So, and a lot can happen. You think 135 years in the past of American history, the Civil War was only 20 years prior to that. We're 135 years ago, people were still using the telegraph. The Continental Railroad is a big deal. 135 years, a lot can happen in 135 years, but in the grand scope of history, it's just a blink of an eye. And God does so much in this period because we see three key leaders in Israel's history. We see Samuel. Obviously, the focus of the first part of the book is on Samuel and his relation with Eli and his relation as a young man in Israel. Then we see him as the final judge of Israel. He's going to help transition Israel from being a tribal people with a very loose theocratic government to a much more structured monarchy. So Samuel is that transitional figure. And so we see the first king of Israel in King Saul. We see Saul's rise to power, and then we see his falls and his many failings. And then we see his replacement. We see his a man after God's own heart in King David, the second king of Israel. Obviously, he's going to be the line that brings forth the Messiah, that brings forth Christ. So this is a great study. It helps us to understand the politics of Israel. It helps us to understand who God is. We see his character. And so whenever I kind of wrap up teaching this introduction, the last thing that I want to focus on is, what do we want the focus of these books to be? What is the focus that what do I want to shine a light on to help? I'm going to hit this over and over and over to help make sure that my students, the people who I'm teaching this to, grasp this thing. The first thing is the emphasis that God has on leadership. You know, we see the failures of Eli. We see the successes of Samuel. We see the successes of Saul, and we see the failures of Saul. We see the successes of David. We see the failures of David. And how who we choose to be our leaders is important. It is important for us to desire good, godly leaders. So the first focus of this book is leadership. The second focus that I want to focus on is personal responsibility. Each of these men have great personal successes and great personal failures, with maybe the exception of Samuel. We'll focus on the one area that I think he fails in as a father, but generally speaking, the scriptures doesn't have a lot to say about Samuel, and we're going to focus on why that's important as well. Third thing is personal character. Who you are when no one's looking. What do you do when the pressure's applied? Fourth thing is God's faithfulness and God's sovereignty. You know, sometimes as fundamentalists or those who are not of a more reformed leaning, we get scared of that word and we forget to emphasize that God is sovereign. And even if you don't ascribe to reformed theology, one of God's attributes is that he is sovereign. He is all-powerful. He is all-powerful over all history. And that shouldn't scare us. We should find comfort in that. We should find peace in that. Don't forget to emphasize that and say, look at how God worked this out to put David into power. Look at how God worked this out to put Saul into power. Look at how God worked this out whenever Eli was failing. And so emphasize God's sovereignty there. And then finally, I want to focus on the consequences of sin, because we're going to see over and over that our sin has consequences and that these men's sin has consequences. And we need to focus on that. We need to emphasize, God desires for us to be holy. Christ tells us, be ye holy as I am holy. We need to desire holiness. God desires for us to be personally holy and accountable unto him. I hope this is a blessing to you and your class. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this study. I'm going to be posting videos each week going through chapter by chapter, breaking down how I teach these verses, these chapters of the Bible. So I hope you guys will subscribe to the channel. If you like this, please let me know down in the comments. And until we see you next time, I hope you have a great day. God bless and keep the faith.